My name is Lesley Mercer. I'm the current TUC President for this year. My day job, so to speak, is the Employment Relations Director of the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. I would like to welcome our panel members here today. Immediate to our left is Professor Stephen Bach from King's College London, and I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel members as when they come to speak. So the format for making use of just under 1.5 hours is that Stephen's going to kick off with this presentation on his recent research, which is very pertinent to the issue that we this seminar, Austerity in the Public Services Workforce. Stephen's going to be spending about 15 minutes doing that. And then I'm going to invite the panel members to comment on what Stephen has presented from their own areas of expertise. But then we will be leaving plenty of time for you to contribute, either ask questions of the panel or to contribute views before we finish. As always, if we can have short, sharp contributions rather than speeches, it means more of you get a chance to have a say, and I think the experience will be richer for us all. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Stephen to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Lesley, and thank you to Matt for inviting me to come here today. I got some funding, was coordinating a project from the European Union through a research stream which looks at industrial relations and social dialogue. And we optimistically perhaps term the project Strengthening Public Services Social Dialogue in an Era of Austerity. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the main findings of the project today in comparative perspective. And then I'm going to drill down and change the kind of level of analysis and talk a little bit about some of the case study work that we did in local government in this country as well. So it hardly needs saying that we are living in tough times. I mean, you and your members know that very, very clearly. And unfortunately, it looks like austerity is going to be with us for some time to come, despite the increasing debate and concern about whether that, about all the negative consequences of austerity for economies as well as for the workforce. But this project, what we really set out to look at three main questions. And this was a one-year project, so we had 1 year's funding from the European Commission, and that funding ended a couple of months ago. So we did this project during 2012. And what we looked at was really, we wanted to, in the 6 countries that we looked at, and I'll say more about those in a minute, we really wanted to understand what were the main drivers and measures of austerity. Because one of the issues that emerged is, although obviously there's massive talk about austerity, in some of the countries, perhaps including Britain as well, there are other things going on in the public sector which are very important in shifts in employment relations. So clearly the debate is dominated by austerity, and that's very important, but there are other things going on as well. The ageing of the workforce, changes in service delivery, a whole range of other pressures as well. And secondly, we wanted to look at how austerity is being implemented and what's the contribution of social dialogue to the change process at different levels, both nationally, sectorally, and at the workplace. And crucially then, we wanted to look at whether the institutions and the practice of social dialogue had actually made any difference. So had consultation, involvement, partnership made a difference to the process, but also the outcomes of austerity. So what we looked at was, we took a comparative approach. So we had research partners in each of these 6 countries, in Denmark, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and the UK, which was effectively England. And we looked at, we wanted to get countries that had variations, both in terms of the size of the public sector and also in terms of the sorts of traditions, the different institutional traditions of social dialogue and workforce involvement. And the project was in 3 broad phases. Firstly, we met with the European Union social partners. So we met with the sectoral social dialogue committees for local government, health, and the civil service at in Brussels, and asked them about the challenges they were facing and how they were responding to the crisis and how their members were responding to the crisis. The second phase was nationally based work. So in each country we looked at the national experience of austerity based on the questions that I've outlined, and we looked at the drivers, the measures, and the consequences of austerity. And then we wanted to get a better feel for what was really going on at the workplace. So we did some case studies in the municipality sector, in the local government sector, in each country, to really drill down and get a sense of what was going on at the workplace level. And we chose local government because we felt there was a degree of autonomy or relative autonomy compared to central government, which is more of a transmission belt for central government and government policy. So we had a model which really summarises what I've said to some extent already. And I'm going to focus mainly on the blue wedge of the in the comments and observations that we're going to make. But basically, we wanted to see whether austerity, what the impact of, if we look at the 2 middle boxes, we wanted to have a look at what austerity, the impact on social dialogue, but we also were interested on whether social dialogue mediated and moderated the impact of austerity measures. So not just that austerity might undermine social dialogue, but the other way around, has social dialogue actually had an effect on actually limiting the impact of austerity? So if I look at the drivers first, we categorised our different countries, not just in terms of economic pressures, but also in terms of kind of political and ideological pressures as well. So what we classified these countries as the kind of the pressures for retrenchment, both internally in terms of whether pressure was internal or whether the pressure was more external, like from the Troika and other sources like that, on the left-hand axis. And we also wanted to look at the degree of pressure, whether the pressure within a country to implement austerity measures was very high, or whether it was more considered, less strong of those pressures. And what we found is that Italy, because of the levels of debt, I haven't put the figures in here, is under very strong pressure to deal with austerity, to implement austerity measures. And that's very much external pressure. While internally, if we look at the other axis, the box, if we look at a country like Denmark, actually the pressures have been much lower, and they're more internal pressures. So it's rather than external pressure, it's internal dynamics that are leading to austerity measures. And the severity of austerity measures are much less in a country like Denmark, which is why we've termed it steady state. And then if we look at some of the other countries, we've called these coalition for change. They're slightly different cases, but clearly here the pressure is high in the UK, for example, but a lot of that is internally generated ideological pressure rather than externally generated. And in France, there's more of a lagged response. So before I look at social dialogue itself, if I just look at some of the outcomes quickly, I think this is a fairly familiar picture. I won't spend much time on it. A rather dispiriting picture, one that's changing all the time. But we see across countries, depending on the severity of austerity measures, we see cuts in pay, pay freezes, reforms to pensions, and also employment reductions, reductions in employment across the public service in these different countries. So if I turn more squarely to social dialogue, what we're really interested in is the impact on, as I said, of austerity on social dialogue, in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of joint consultation, and whether these mechanisms have actually had an effect on limiting the degree of austerity within different countries. And we identified 3 scenarios in terms of the relationship between austerity and social dialogue. The first one we call restriction. And basically this is where austerity and the measures that government are taking are actually interrupting and freezing social dialogue within that country. And we see strong shifts to unilateralism. So that's one scenario that we identified. A second one is more of resilience, where we see the institutions of social dialogue are relatively resilient. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems and challenges, but the institutions remain in place. And thirdly, we see processes of change and what we might term loosely renewal, where there are reforms of social dialogue going on. So, for example, changes in the criteria used within works councils in different countries, or attempts to kind of, like in France, renew social dialogue and strengthen social dialogue in some ways. And what we saw was strong variations, both between countries, but also within individual countries as well. So if I take the first scenario, restriction, this is something that we saw at national level within all countries, perhaps with the exception of Denmark. And was particularly marked in the Czech Republic, Italy, and the UK. And what we see here is that austerity programs are being introduced, and related measures like pay freezes or wage cuts, employment reductions, with very little, if any, input from employers and trade unions. And I think this raises big questions about what we term the hollowing out of employment relations or industrial relations. The reason why governments argue they're doing this is because they're under so much pressure. The time scales, this is the rationale they gave to us, that the time scales are very limited, that they have to make measures quickly because of market sentiment and other reasons, but this in a sense hollows out and removes the scope for national industrial relations practice. The other point about this is that in many of these countries there are things like internal stability pacts, where legislative and other budgetary measures dominate. They are dominant in terms of austerity measures that are being followed. So there isn't scope for social dialogue with the social partners, or it's much more difficult because of legislative and budgetary instruments or fiscal criteria that say, you know, we need to meet these deficit or debt criteria. So restriction was widespread, but having said that, at sectoral and enterprise level, we saw more engagement in many of the countries. So I just want to turn briefly to the other scenarios, resilience and reconfiguration. And in these countries, in different ways, we saw that social dialogue was more resilient. So the institutions of social dialogue were more resilient. So in Denmark, there were still negotiations, there were still wage agreements concluded. In the Netherlands as well, differences between different sectors, but the process of collective bargaining was still continuing in some form. And then if we look more at sectoral or enterprise level, we see that, again, there are variations within countries, and some of those variations we might pick up in discussion were linked to employer strategy, trade union strategy about their ability to broaden the agenda, and also different institutional and legal traditions. So in some countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, there are institutional mechanisms like works councils, forms of co-determination, where there has to be agreement before job losses can be agreed. So finally, in my last 5 minutes maybe, or slightly less, I just wanted to give you a flavour of the case study work just in England. I'm skipping the national level in the UK because I'm sure we're all familiar with that. I just wanted to give you a flavour of what was going on at local level. There's more information in the reports, but I just wanted to highlight 2 different case studies that we looked at in local government. One that we termed coastal and one that we termed Midtown. And I think the big point is that there is scope for variation in terms of, even with 27–30% cuts in local government, there is scope for variation in how employers and trade unions can deal with these difficult issues. So coastal, which some of you may work out where it is, I'll skip this. It's a pretty negative story, a very low trust dynamic, widespread industrial action on the back of Section 188s, and a very low trust dynamic, and continuing problems within that council. One of the interesting things there was they'd outsourced all their HR, and there was no in-house capacity to deal with HR. And this created enormous employment relations problems, and the trade unions had a particular strategy that I think was quite effective, although of course there were different views about that we might discuss. But I think was quite But what I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on was what we call Midtown, because I think this is perhaps where there are more interesting lessons or examples, or in terms of perhaps where employment relations in the sector is going. What we saw here was a very sophisticated HR management team, where they've actually there's been resilience, but also reconfiguration of social dialogue, joint consultation and collective bargaining, much more towards an employer-led performance management agenda. And what they've done is they froze contractual increments. They got both the 2 unions involved. There was a local collective agreement. Both unions signed up to it. It was passed in ballots. But they gave some money back through what they called a partnership payment, depending on things like attendance, appraisal. So workers got, if you like, a bonus, but at the same time, because they lost their increments temporarily, they still saw real-term cuts in their pay. But the important point is that the workforce voted for and to some degree bought into this agreement. And I think that's very interesting. Why is that? I think that's really because without any national pay increase, when I interviewed refuse collectors and others, they say, well, we haven't had any pay increase. At least if we agree to this, we've got to work harder, we might save our job, our attendance has got to be better, but we're going to get a bonus payment at the end of the year. That may be uncomfortable things to hear, but I think that's maybe where we're going to see some of these developments going more over the next few years. So let me finish before Lesley tells me to shut up. I've gone through the material very quickly. We do have a website which has all the national reports and also the comparative report. And also, there's more work on austerity in the European Union Industrial Relations in Europe report that's just been published, and I contributed to some of that work as well. I think the overall headline messages are austerity. I think the public sector is still a distinctive employer. We're seeing in most countries a return to some kind of centralised unilateralism. Social dialogue has been in retreat. And obviously, this has very negative effects for the workforce, but there are ways in which some of this can be mediated in some circumstances where there has been dialogue between employers and trade unions. But I think there are big questions for the future about whether the public sector can remain an employer of choice, or whether we're going to see even worse shortages and demoralisation occurring, not just in this country, but we see this occurring in some of the other countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I think for those of us who are industrial relations practitioners, it's really useful from time to time to have an academic, a research perspective to make us think about our work. Now, for the benefit of the number of people who've come in during the course of that presentation, now we're going to invite a number of people on the panel to sort of comment on what Stephen said and bring a flavour of their own experience to this issue. I'm going to start with Gail Cartmail on my left, who's a colleague from TUC General Counsel and an Assistant General Secretary of UNITE.
Thanks very much, Lesley. I am going to look at the national structures. I'm going to touch on public service forum, pension negotiation, facility time, government pay policy, and the impact of privatisation. Public service forum, for the uninitiated, was established by a Labour government, social partnership forum, very much under the promise of no surprises. Following the Foundation Trust Hospital initiative in parentheses. It did some okay stuff, some good stuff. I've been involved in it, worked on good practice guidance for equality impact assessments and that type of thing. Rubbed along, but as perhaps there's no surprise to this audience, there was a whole range of New Labour issues that, for example, cooperative involvement, social enterprise, that were real pinch points, pressure points. Now, that social partnership forum nationally survived the early period of coalition, our austerity government, and the initial discussions on pension reforms were dealt with in that environment. And I understand, and TUC colleagues here will add to this perhaps, that there is a view that those public service forum meetings may be resumed. That will be interesting. Pension negotiations, I mentioned in relation to the Social Partnership Forum, well, they were led by Cabinet Office and Treasury Ministers Francis Maude from Conservatives and Danny Alexander for the Liberal Democrats in the coalition. And I think the reason I'm touching on this national stuff is because it kind of trickles down and cascades across. I mean, what I learned from those discussions, because I was a party to them, is that they had no understanding of negotiation. There are trade unionists in this room who understand the meaning of negotiation and consultation, and it's my view that neither of the two ministers had the faintest idea what that was about. Consequently, of course, we had no movement at all on any of the main pension headings, and one thing that we thought we'd moved on, the normal pension age, was taken off the table unilaterally and no further discussion following Treasury guidance. So that kind of then took us down to another level of scheme-specific talks. Now, what I would observe in those scheme-specific talks was that there was social dialogue. It's interesting, Stephen, it's social dialogue in relation to the local government pension scheme, the funded scheme, where there was genuine collaborative work between the trade unions, the employer representatives, who then formed quite a force in relation to Treasury Googlies that were thrown into those discussions. Move then on to the all-important issue of facility time. Here we are in an era of austerity. Our people at the coalface have more to do in defence of services, jobs, etc. But it interests me that at the same time that we had social partnership forum, if you will, public service forum at national level, the issue of facility time was used as a political football, not in just one Conservative Party conference, but in consecutive Conservative Party conferences by none other than Francis Maude. And it was kind of red meat to the Tory party conference, and Eric Pickles added to that. And it was all trumpeted as a success for the Taxpayers Alliance. But interestingly, TUC research has said it's an inflated issue. The number of people on whole-time facility is very small. And the reality is employers at operational level are trying to slow down the abolition of people on full-time facility in some areas. One of our MOD people in particular, just an example, he has 60 redundancy consultations on this table, and the last thing his operational manager wants him to do is to change a light bulb at this moment in time. And it's hard to imagine that at Oxford City Council, where there was a development of a local 3-year deal, including the minimum wage, including the living wage and a deal on job securities, it's hard to see that that employer would have been scraping on facility time. So these are political choices. Just touching on government pay policy, it's unique in two ways. First of all, it's confined to the public sector. It's never been a pay policy that's only confined to the public sector. And also, it doesn't have a crisis element. So all government pay policies previously have covered more than one sector of the economy, and there's also a crisis balance. The outcome of that is that it is reducing our members' income by about 50% in real terms by the end of this Parliament. But also underlying that is pay review bodies, and I think many in this room question their independence. How independent are the pay review bodies in relation to evidence given? And there has been seesaw discussions. Again, one might say Agenda for Change was an example of genuine social partnership started by a Labour government in response partly to our equal pay challenges, threatened by the South West Cartel. And to what extent the South West Cartel is dead and buried, I think remains to be seen. Leslie, I've done 5 minutes. We said 5 to 10. Have I got a couple of more minutes?
Literally.
Okay, 2. I want to touch on the impact of the third sector and contestability and the greater role for the private sector. Just 2 examples. Fragmentation, Serco members of the same pension scheme, scattered across local government, health, civil service. Serco has sidestepped even the statutory minimum standard of consultation on pension changes with recognised trade unions. We're currently putting a complaint into the trustees and the pensions regulator. Turning Point, a huge not-for-profit organisation, has triggered Section 188, the mechanism used by Southampton City Council, the coastal town, to force through changes to terms and conditions despite assurances to transferred staff. And all of the above is having a toxic impact on quality. So on the one hand, we've got the Francis Review, and on the other hand, we've got very, very high levels of concern being expressed by our members. And I'll finish on this example because it's a public interest example. Our union Unite has just been de-recognised by Yorkshire Ambulance Services for resisting the introduction of a grade mix that reduces the qualified paramedic team by 50%. In other words, one qualified paramedic alongside an unqualified paramedic, a model that our ambulance professionals think is unsafe, which has resulted in local de-recognition. And I think it's those issues that are going to cause tensions where our members are fighting for quality, not just terms and conditions of employment. I think that's where our future agenda may reside.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you for finishing off on a note about quality service. Different government. A few years ago when there was a real problem about matching newly qualified health professionals with work in the NHS. It wasn't that their skills weren't needed, it's that the system, because it was in clampdown over the last kind of financial crisis in the NHS, just couldn't cope with actually getting them into the jobs that they needed. And we largely resolved that through partnership. But I would be the last to over-exaggerate the benefits. But I think I agree with you on accountability. I agree with you on some of the specific projects where we have managed to make some difference. It's also an extremely useful source of information and contact and relationship building, which is hard to put a price tag on, but can be very useful. So I do very much, from my experience, concur with that. Our next contributor on June's left is John Medhurst, who's a policy officer from PCS, absolutely in the firing line of all government policies, which are hostile to trade unions at the moment.
Yes, thank you. I was hoping to provide very briefly a sort of perspective from that of civil service trade unions, from trade unions that deal directly with the government as an employer, which is obviously slightly different from local government and elsewhere. And government as an employer, it's fair to say, has never really brought into the concept of social partnership, of whatever political stripe, really. I mean, it's fair to say that the last government engaged in more genuine negotiations, more open-ended negotiations, and a certain level of consultation with civil service trade unions, but really not from the perspective of an actual deliberate, conscious strategy of social partnership, more because it would have caused more problems not to have done some level of consultation and discussion. The British government per se has really never brought into the more European concept of social partnership, and this government certainly has not the slightest conception or interest in partnership of any kind. I mean, as a few examples, I mean, we do have, to give you some brief background, there is a national body for civil service trade unions. It used to be the CCSU, Civil Service Unions. Now it's called the TUC, and basically it's the main civil service unions, which is PCS and Prospect and FDA. There are some other unions, Unite, GMB, PLA in it, but they are because they don't have as much membership in the civil service. It is mainly the civil service unions, and we do have certain discussions with government representatives from civil service resourcing in the Cabinet Office who report to Francis Maude, the Minister for the Cabinet Office. But you couldn't in any genuine sense say that was, as Gail said, it was prize negotiation. They have no real concept or interest in negotiation as such. We saw that in the pensions dispute, where the main planks of what they were offering, what they were imposing, were on the table and were never even up for discussion. We've seen that certainly in the civil service, which has imposed a pay freeze for the first 2 years since 2010, and then imposed a 1% pay limit for the following 2 years. So with the inflation being what it is, effectively 4 years of pay detriment. And there's no sense of any kind of discussion or negotiation on that. It was only this year, for the first time since the coalition took over, that we received the enormous privilege of seeing the Treasury's pay remit to civil service departments a few days before it was given to them. But in previous years we hadn't even seen it. Let alone, I mean, we offered some comments, which we of course ignored. But you know, no way could you in any way deem this discussion or negotiation. I mean, to give you a few examples specifically that we're dealing with now that I think highlight that. Coming directly from the Minister for the Civil Service, Francis Maude, and that strand of the Tory party that he represents, we've at the moment got a major review of all civil service terms and conditions, which was, I mean, it's given to departments to do, and it will be taken forward in different ways in departments, but it was imposed from the top without any warning or consultation with us. And the first we heard about it was when the bomb dropped, and we were told that all terms and conditions were, with no justification or reason, were up for review. And this led to what the NTUC called a fundamental rupture in industrial relations in the civil service, which I think is an accurate description. We've had similarly the current attacks on facility time for civil service trade union representatives, the withdrawal of 100% facility time, of which there was not an enormous amount, but some of the bigger departments did have reps with 100% facility time, and the cutting of other levels of facility time. And now we have threats which yet to be actioned, but possibly will be to check off, the departments sort of checking off the subscriptions that members pay the unions, which obviously would cause us a major problem. I mean, the specific attack and problem that I personally deal with at the moment for the NTUC, just 1 minute to explain something that we have in the civil service called the protocols, which is protocols around avoidance, if we can, of unnecessary compulsory redundancies. Obviously, with the massive cuts to civil service departments' budgets, headcount reduction is one way, the primary way of driving those cuts through, and therefore there are an increasing number of voluntary redundancies, which are voluntary nominally, really, because many people take them for financial reasons, or compulsory redundancies. Now, in 2008, with the last government, we did negotiate an agreement called the Protocols that looked at a period of what was called meaningful consultation of about 90 days to mirror the statutory period, where civil service departments, their HR departments and national networks run from the Cabinet Office would look at all ways to redeploy within the civil service those who wanted to continue their civil service careers, some wouldn't. And that has minimised the number of compulsory redundancies, and it's worked well. However, a few months ago, we received notification again from the top, from ministers. This did not come from the officials we work with. We know this because we've worked on tweaking these procedures for the last few years. That the protocols essentially, although an agreement, a signed agreement between the civil service trade union general secretaries, the permanent secretaries and ministers, an actual treaty, if you like, a signed agreement, is essentially going to be torn up. I mean, they've suggested things to us that, of course, if we don't agree, they will impose. So there's no sense of consultation. I mean, what they suggest and what they will presumably impose, unless we can in some way deflect it, is that when we're looking at a number of at-risk employees who are at risk of compulsory redundancy, when those employees in any department or area number over 100, the consultation period will be reduced from 90 to 45 to mirror the change that BIS introduced to the statutory period. When it's less than 100, when it's between 20 and 99, it'll be reduced to 30 days, which doesn't give an awful lot of time to look at redeployment, and when it's less than 20, it'll be reduced to nothing. And so there'll be no meaningful consultation whatsoever. And what was the end of that process was a period, what we called in the protocols, a period of reflection, which was a 6-week period where you stopped before you issued notices to finally look at the individuals that you were dealing with, look at their circumstances, their skills, what they wanted, what they could do, and look at all possible options within the civil service, travelling distance and whatever, for last-minute redeployment. Now they want to remove that and just replace that with what they call a review, which we suspect will be one meeting that will simply sign off what little has been done before. So effectively, the protocols are an agreement we did have as a result of some form of social partnership is essentially being torn up. And I mean, that, for me, underpins my last sort of point, my conclusion, if you like, which is, I think, what we're seeing. We had many concerns and issues and problems with previous Labour government, but what we're seeing, I think, with this government is a deliberate ideological attack on trade unions designed to destroy us, or at the very least weaken our ability to function. We may exist, but to no great effect. And we see that, I think, in the quality and the politics of the people we're dealing with. Gail mentioned the sort of the hard right of the Tory party that's mobilising now. We've got things like the trade union reform campaign run by some extremely dodgy MPs who are pushing these attacks on facility time, on check-off, on our ability to function and exist. And that campaign, which David Cameron has endorsed, is run by an MP called Aidan Burley, hard right MP, who was the infamous sort of Nazi-wearing fancy dress party, and who called the Olympic opening ceremony multicultural crap. And I think he reflects a lot of the ideological politics that today's Tory party is pushing, and is pushing through campaigns like this to target and attack trade unions, especially public sector trade unions, because of course they see that we are the primary and sometimes the only opposition to their austerity agenda. I mean, lastly, Stephen's report and research found that in some senses most of the institutional architecture of social dialogue remains in place, and that's true. I mean, we still have the TUC meets with the Cabinet Office to discuss the changes to, say, the civil service protocols, and you know, we're allowed in the building. So in that sense, the architecture exists, but there's nothing in the architecture. You know, we're allowed in and we can go up and down in the lifts, but we can't really do anything. So you know, they have gutted out and hollowed that architecture to the point that it's almost meaningless. And we see that more starkly in the civil service. Of course, there's less room for flexibility, I think, and therefore we're engaged in a dispute, a massive national dispute with them. But I think that it's worth noting, because you see, I think, in it very starkly what I think they would do if they could in other sectors. I'll leave you to think about that and finish there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. Yeah, indeed, it's the reality rather than the theory that matters in all these things. Our last contributor, before we throw it open, is Margaret Thomas, who's responsible for UNISON in Wales, but is here on behalf of the Wales TUC. I think lots of us are looking very enviously at Wales these days in terms of the quality of social dialogue and collective bargaining. So I'm assuming that's what you're going to be talking about, Margaret.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk about the Welsh experience. And we are facing similar challenges, so everything isn't rosy in Wales. But I'm going to talk to you how we're responding to those challenges. And we are fortunate to have a Welsh Labour government, but we haven't been saved from the dramatic cuts that have been imposed across the UK. The Welsh budget has been cut the same way that all the other UK government departments and funding has been cut. But what's different is how the Welsh Government has been using its ever-decreasing resources, and how the trade union movement, particularly the Wales TUC, has been working in partnership with the Welsh Government to try and meet those challenges and to protect our members' jobs, conditions of service, and continue to support communities. So it's important for me to explain what the Welsh Government's approach is to public services, because that lays the foundation for partnership. And I'm going to give you a quote from Carwyn Jones, our First Minister, when he attended a special conference of the Wales TUC in 2010, when we looked at how we were going to deal with austerity across Wales. And he said, "I want to see best practice being shared and delivered across Welsh public services, and that includes best practice in employee relations. Engagement, negotiation and agreement, not diktat. I want the Welsh Government, employers and unions working together to seek solutions, to be the only way in Welsh public services. And this means sticking to our principles, no two-tier workforce, no knee-jerk outsourcing, commitments to fair terms if transfers take place, and a continued adherence to our workforce code of practice from all sides." So that's where we started off, a fantastic base for us to work in partnership with the Welsh Government and the employers across Wales. So rather than cut services, make compulsory redundancies and outsource, the Welsh Government has agreed to work with the trade unions, and particularly the Wales TUC, to seek to protect public services and to deliver these through existing public service workforce. So transfers within and between public service, between public services, training and development are at the heart of this alternative approach. Now, the vast majority of public sector workers in Wales work within the devolved areas like health, local government, education, but we also have a large number of members who work in the UK government non-devolved areas, and it's those areas my colleague from PCS mentioned where we're seeing the biggest attacks in Wales. So we've got a commitment to partnership working, which is underpinned by the Workforce Partnership Council. Now, this is a body that negotiates the delivery of the Welsh Way for public services. And the Workforce Partnership Council has equal representation from trade unions and employers, and it's chaired by the First Minister himself. If he isn't available, it's chaired by the Minister for Local Government. So it's given a very high profile in Wales. And the Wales TUC General Secretary is the trade union side secretary, and he coordinates the work of the trade unions on this body. Back in 2011, the Workforce Partnership Council agreed a memorandum of understanding in local government, and this was the first agreement of its kind in Wales. And it was designed to provide a series of steps to be undertaken by local authorities ahead of looking at redundancies. Now, we had some successes with this, but it didn't go unchallenged because we also had some authorities who didn't want to apply the Memorandum of Understanding. Back in 2011, we only had 2 Labour-controlled authorities in Wales. So, as a result of this, the Workforce Partnership Council put pressure on the Welsh Government. And the Welsh Government then produced a green paper and asked for consultation around how they should deliver the Workforce Partnership Council and what statutory footing, if any, should be agreed in the future. That was out for consultation last year, and the responses were published earlier this month. And the next steps, we hope we will see legislation in Wales that will give statutory footing to the Workforce Partnership Council. But it will go in front of the Workforce Partnership Council for discussion. But we do hope that legislation, as I said, will be produced shortly and will be enacted by the end of this year. The Code gives protection to Welsh public service workers in any services that are outsourced. It helps reduce the incentives to outsource and supports workers in public services previously outsourced who are struggling. The new Act will also give statutory force to agreements of the Workforce Partnership Council in the future. And this will go a long way to ensuring the alternative approach to Welsh public service delivery is a reality in every devolved public service area, and it will remove the ability of individual employers to seek to adopt a different model. So that's how we're doing things in Wales. We know we've got lots of challenges ahead of us, particularly over the next 2 years with the substantial cuts in the Welsh Government revenue budget. However, at least we're at a better starting position than our UK colleagues. We're committed to making this work, not just for trade union members and communities across the length and breadth of Wales, but for Wales itself. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. So it is indeed rather different in Wales. Right now,